from Ethan Siegel, PhD, Department of History, Michigan State University. So I'm not gonna read all he did. I'm going to pretty much give you somewhat of a summary or concise, not even a summary. I'm gonna give you a concise version of his essay, and it's still kind of long. So now let's go back. In the 1850s, as a matter of fact, I'm going to make this a gonna make this. You know what? Let me change my Let me change my thumbnail. No, I don't have to. I can do it later. Cause I'm actually gonna, after I'm done with this live, I'm gonna actually make this a a video for those who want to research how Japan became a 40-year superpower. I'm sorry, how Japan became a superpower in 40 some odd years, right? So I'm gonna change the thumbnail you see now. I'm gonna change it to something like Japan, something like that, the Japan flag, because this is history and everything I'm reading is history. I told you how I got it from. Department of History, Michigan State University, PhD, Ethan Siegel. And I watch other documentaries, and I don't think they was as detailed as this essay. So this is why I want to make this a part of that search that search engine. Okay. In the 1850s, Japan was politically divided into many competing warlord domains. A lot of sovereign citizens in Japan at that time. The most powerful warlord, the shogun, ruled almost as a dictator. Leaders severely limited contacts with the outside world. Japan was seen as a closed country that engaged in oh my God, diplomacy with few of its neighbors. Yep, some of those words, man, tongue twisters for me. Diplomacy. But anyway, they didn't want no contact with the outside world. They were segregating themselves from the rest of the world. Bad idea. Some people today want to do that. No names. Some groups today want to do that. In America, they want to separate themselves from the outside world. I think they could do it themselves. They're going to reinvent the wheel or bring something new. Okay. So, a few of his neighbors they dealt with. By the 1920s, things had changed. Japan had become a constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected parliament. It had a modern military that had won two major wars overseas. Okay, so this is giving you like a briefing. I don't want to go to briefing. I want to start from the top, right here. So no briefing, just history. No spoilers. In the early 1600s, the Tokugawa warrior clan established an enduring samurai government. What kind of government? A samurai government. Its leader, the shogun, ruled from the city of Edo, modern day Tokyo. The Tokugawa shoguns directly controlled about one fourth of the country, 25% of the country they controlled. And you might say that's small. No. The remaining lands were divided among the 200 warlords. So they had even smaller than that, small fraction. More than 200 warlords, and they had control of some lands too, but very, very small. So the shogun out of the warlords controlled the most land, and it was like 25%. So if I share the screen, you're going to be looking at my Microsoft Word. I'm actually reading it, Microsoft Word. So that's why I got that up. Peace, Viosa. But I'm going to, when I'm done with this, I'm going to, share something. All right. So anyway, 200 warlords split up the rest of the country. The Tokugawa shoguns controlled one fourth of the country. These warlords were known as daimyo. Okay, so the Damayo was the other 200 some odd warlords. Some Damayo were allies of the Tokugawa, that's the shogun. So some Damayo warlords were allies of the Tokugawa warlords. So other outside daimyo were enemies who submitted after being defeated in battle. So other daimyo warlords that was not allies got beat up by the shogun. Japan was politically divided during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. They were divided. These are Japanese people. They were not in one accord, like some people think. All right. The first three Tokugawa shoguns established a number of policies to ensure stability and prevent the daimyo from rising up against them. For example, so why people act like governments want a coup d'etat? Like they're gonna put policies in place where nobody can start a coup or some warlord stuff. For example, they instituted the alternate attendance system. This system required warlords to live in Edo every other year. During the years of the warlords returned to their domains, during the years that the warlords returned to their domains, they had to leave their wives and children in Edo. If they attack the Bakufu, their families will be killed. Mafia style, baby. The Tokugawa also established a rigid class system inspired by Confucian thinking. Samurai were at the top. They were to be respected because only they could rule the country. All right? Only the samurai can rule the country. That's why I read it was a samurai government. That would make sense, right? Next were farmers. So here's the class system. Samurai at the top. Next were farmers and craftsmen. Merchants were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were looked down upon because they did not make or grow anything. They were looked down upon because they did not make or grow anything. Okay. Instead, they profited by selling things produced by other people. Sounds familiar. They profited by selling things produced by other people. Even among the samurai, distinctions and status were very important. Samurai from outside domains were never allowed to serve in the Bakufu government. Positions were reserved for samurai from allied domains. These positions became hereditary over time. Finally, the Tokugawa very carefully regulated contacts with the outside world. They outlawed Christianity and only permitted trade with the Dutch, Chinese, Koreans, and Akinwans. No Christianity. We don't want that. Keep your white Jesus. Keep your Bible. Initially, these policies worked quite well in keeping the peace, but the early 19th century, they had become the source of many problems. The Daimyo were spending more than half of their domain incomes on the alternate attendance system. Middle and lower ranked samurai were frustrated because they were excluded from higher positions in government, as were samurai from outside domains, remember? Meanwhile, some merchants became rich. So the bottom merchants, some became rich while samurai lived in poverty. Oh, we can't have that. There's a class system here. And samurai is supposed to be on the top and merchants on the bottom, but we got samurai poor, at least the outside ones, and we got merchants rich. Okay. This fact seemed to contradict the class ideology, of course. This fact seemed to contradict the class ideology, of course it did, which taught that samurai should be respected. As these domestic problems were leading more and more people to question the Tokugawa Bakufu, foreign ships started appearing in Japanese water, foreign ships, pressuring the Japanese to open their ports. The Bakufu was unable to turn them away. Yeah, I always wondered, like, how the hell are they speaking to each other? Russian spoke Russian, whatever that language that is, and the French, they spoke French, and The Italians spoke what they spoke, and the Americans spoke. You know what I mean? So how did they communicate with each other, and then and how they communicate with the Japanese and Chinese? I always wanted that. Maybe y'all could tell me. In 1854, Japan reluctantly signed a trade agreement with the Americans. So they reluctantly signed a trade agreement with the Americans. This was the first of several unequal treaties. That's actually a term, unequal treaties. The Japanese signed the Western colonial powers. The Japanese signed with Western colonial powers. The treaties were seen as unequal for several reasons. First, they forced the Japanese to accept tariff rates set by foreign powers. Second, they provided for extraterritoriality. This meant that foreigners accused of crimes were to be judged in courts in their own countries, not in Japanese courts. Now that's what, yeah. You know, is that what the Moors be talking about? The black Moors and the sovereign citizens, the white ones of America? Because this is what they talking about. This is what the tariffs and things that Americans had the Japanese sign. If we come to your country and we do some illegal BS, y'all can't prosecute us. We could only get prosecuted back in our country. So the best you can do is kick us out. But only our government can prosecute us. So, I mean, this is the only time I heard, you know, stuff like that could happen, is when these unequal treaties. So sovereign citizens and black Moors need to explain the unequal treaty America and Morocco had, not the equal one, not the peace treaty. Interesting. Third, the treaties forced the Japanese to open certain ports to foreign merchants. So that's the third part of the treaty. Japanese saw the treaties as further signs of Tokugawa weakness. So they didn't feel like their government was strong enough to resist the Westerners. Yet opinions vary greatly on how to respond to the West. Some felt Japan needed to be open so the Japanese could learn from the rest of the world. Smart. Others were more hostile to Westerners. Sounds familiar. Their slogan was revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. Interesting. Sounds familiar. The most radical members of such groups attacked foreigners living in Japan, as well as Bakufu officials. I'm guessing foreigners are Westerners. In the 1860s, samurai, particularly lower and middle ranked samurai from outside domains, unified the opposition to the Tokugawa. They destroyed the Bakufu and founded a new government with the goals of eliminating class distinctions, modernizing the country, and standing up to the Western powers. Sounds good on paper, right? Everybody got a plan till they get punched in the mouth. Okay. I'm trying to read the comments okay. So I'm gonna try to read the comments later because y'all got interesting stuff there. The establishment of this new government in 1868 marked the beginning of Japan's Meiji period. I gotta know how to pronounce that because that's gonna be here a lot going forward. I just can't be making that mistake all day. So hold on. I refuse to make that mistake all day. All right. Let me click on something that, okay, here we go.
I think we should.
Oh, I can't mess that name up all day.
The Meiji Restoration.
Meiji. it's funny because when you see how it was spelled, the like magi, the Meiji. Okay, so it's called Meiji. Meiji. Got it. Cool. The establishment of this new government in 1868 marked the beginning of Japan's Meiji period, 1868 to 1912. Okay, so we're talking about governments here. I hear the Moors talk about government. I don't really hear other black folks talking about that too much. So anyway, it is also sometimes called the Meiji Restoration. In theory, the new government restored power to Japan's ancient line of emperors. The emperors were powerless figureheads in Tokugawa times, right? The shogun rule. The ministers implemented important programs and policies to unify the country. First, they abolished the warlord domains, right? They got rid of that craziness. In their place, Meiji officials created prefectures, similar to the 50 United States, okay? So they're looking at how the Westerners are doing it and say, yo, I like that idea that those Americans got with the 50 states. Let's go ahead and adopt that in Japan. See, so they're learning from Westerners who some call barbarians. They realize, nah, these guys got something good over there and we could use it. So they're not being stupid like some people be. So they're gonna take some meat, throw away the bone, because they banned Christianity. The former Daimyo were given large settlements to compensate them for the lands they lost. So those, in case you're wondering what happened to those warlords, they were given large settlements. The Meiji government gained control over the entire country. Okay, so it was no longer divided. Remember, the shogun only controlled 1/4, and the other 75% was divided up, very little by little from by the in little parts by the 200 and so warlords. So they had control of the entire country now. Second, national leaders formally eliminated the hierarchical class system. This reform did away with the special status of samurais. So that whole samurai stuff, gone. All of Japan's people were declared to be equal citizens. Very important. Equality, baby. Where are we at? Third, the government required children to attend elementary school. So that wasn't a bad idea from those Americans. It also required young men to serve in the military. Education and military conscription helped create a sense of common identity among people of different backgrounds and regions. So education helped create a sense of common identity among people of different backgrounds and regions. Education did that. Proper education, not no pseudoscience and fairy tale goofy stuff. Legit education was almost enough by itself to get the people to look at each other like they're not different from each other. All right. Military also. It also gave the government a chance to teach loyalty to the new Japanese government. The new government was committed to learning from the West. Uh-oh. They didn't have that problem. They knew the West was popping. They was onto something. Their hatred, their stereotypes, whatever they felt, their biases, gone. They're not stupid. The new government was committed to learning from the West. In doing so, it hoped to strengthen itself and revise the unequal treaties. In 1868, it issued the Charter Oath. The oath was a 5-article document outlining the principles of the Meiji administration. It declared it declared that knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. So they were pro education. It also said that evil customs of the past shall be discontinued. You see, they didn't justify their super predators. Evil acts got to go. All right. We're going to move forward here. Education, we're about that. Education vibes only. Okay. Japanese began studying abroad. In 1872, the Iwakura mission, a group of diplomats that included some of the new government's most important figures, began to travel around the world. Members of the mission were to observe the countries along with touring factories and industrial facilities. The Japanese studied social customs. They found strange, for example, the high status and personal freedoms women enjoyed in the United States. Okay, so the United States was one of the first countries to allow women to have rights. So y'all can say what y'all want to say, but they said the United States was trendsetters. They were trendsetters in a lot of ways. Trendsetters in a lot of ways. The Western nations they perceived were unlikely to negotiate unless Japan became more civilized, in quotes. In the minds of many Europeans and Americans, this meant Japan had to become more Western. So America pushed for Japan to be more Western. Okay, so definitely. All right. The Meiji leaders also believed that they needed to become more like the Western imperial powers if they hoped to retain their independence. They hired a number of foreign experts to help train the Japanese in various aspects of modern life. So, if y'all ain't get it by now, the foreign experts are the Westerners. They hired a number of foreign experts to help train the Japanese in various aspects of modern life. So they knew their education was very valuable. They didn't disrespect it. They took advantage of it. Just like other foreigners that come to this country, they take the education and they run with it and they do great by it. Americans aided with agriculture and education. Okay, so that's how Americans helped them. Other countries, France and other people helped them as well. The army drew largely on Prussian models. Meiji officials also started acting and dressing like Western bureaucrats. Japanese diplomats used to wear kimono and samurai swords. They now started wearing European coat and tails. This was true even for the emperor and empress of Japan. One important slogan of the time was "Bumi Keika," which means civilization and enlightenment. Civilization and enlightenment. That's what they stood by. Japanese government officials were supposedly trying to learn from the West in order to strengthen Japan. So they weren't afraid to learn from Europeans, take advantage of the Western educational system, like some are. This is why nobody really becomes successful without it. Social and political programs were expensive. Thus, the government had to come up with new sources of revenue. Taxation was one area for reform. Most of the economy was still agricultural. So land taxes were an important source of income. The Meiji government switched to a tax system based on assessments of the land's value. Thus, it couldn't count on regular tax income, whether harvests were good or bad. The government also took steps to strengthen its currency. In the 1880s, Finance Minister Matsukata shrank the money supply to stop inflation. His policies helped bolster the value of government money. Tax reform and deflation hurt farmers. However, they had to pay the same amount in taxes if they had had a bad harvest. Damn. Meiji, damn, at least we got a tax write-off. You see? And y'all mad at our government. Best government in the world. Meiji leaders also tried to help the economy industrialize. They promoted industrial technology by importing cotton mills, spinning machinery, and the like. Model factories set up with government support were then sold to private businessmen. Of course, those private entrepreneurs also play important roles in the growth of the economy. The most successful, such as Iwasaki Yaturo, founder of the Mitsubishi conglomerate. Who? Indigenous, this is for you. Iwasaki Yataro. Iwasaki Yataro, founder of the Mitsubishi conglomerate. Who's that? They were similar to the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts of the United States. So they were your elite class in Japan. So when y'all say Bilderberger, DuPont family, Rockefellers, add in Mitsubishi. Or Iwasaki Yataro, founder of the Mitsubishi conglomerate, were similar to the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts of the United States. Finally, the workers themselves made important contributions to economic growth. Japan desperately needed Western hard currency to pay for technology and foreign experts. Huh? They needed Western hard currency. Western. But some people think they could do it without the Westerners. And when I say Westerners, I mean their education. Some people think they can do it without Western education. Good luck. In the early Meiji period, silk was one of the few Japanese products foreigners wanted to buy. Young women, often working in very poor conditions, produced silk for export. Their laborers played a key role in Japan's ability to purchase foreign goods and industrialize so quickly. Not every aspect of the government's reform program was by the design of officials. Explain. The Meiji Constitution, or they had a constitution, for example, was largely the result of pressure from the Japanese people. Citizens saw a more active role in government in the 1870s and 1880s. Some formed political parties to push for a constitution and a popularly elected parliament to represent the people. In 1881, disagreements over these matters became intense, so members of the government even resigned from office. Those remaining promised a constitution by 1890. A key government figure, Ito Hirobumi, traveled to Europe to study constitutions. Where did he travel? He studied to Europe to study constitutions. Drawing heavily on Prussian and Austrian models, he drafted the Meiji Constitution. Okay. The emperor presented the Constitution to the people in 1889, like 100 years after ours. It proclaimed that the highest authority resided with the emperor. He could appoint ministers, control the army and navy, and dissolve the parliament if he thought it necessary. Okay, so the American Constitution was the first time where the people were ruled by laws. It's the first time in the world's history, where people were ruled by laws and not necessarily a person, a dictator, that type of stuff. Like this emperor from Japan. who could appoint ministers, control the army and navy, and dissolve the parliament if he thought it necessary. But it also provided for a legislative parliament that consisted of two houses. Two houses. They really studied the Constitution. The upper house included members of the nobility and others appointed by the emperor. Lower house representatives were elected by popular vote. Only male citizens who paid 15 yen or more in taxes were allowed to vote. Got to pay 15 yen or more in taxes if you want to vote in the Japanese system. And y'all mad at our Constitution? Y'all crazy. This was around 5% of the total male population. So about 5% of the males in Japan could actually vote. Yeah, I'm aware of the Bill of Rights in UK, but my brother, I'll say it again. We got the first constitution because I read UK's constitution, read the whole thing. So we got the only constitution in mankind history, or we're the first country to be ruled by laws and not a person. And religion is not even associated. So UK religion was there, by the way. Yeah, I read that already, Dilla. But they have religion all in theirs, UK, and they were still ruled by the king and queen of England. And this, so what Americans did was they revised it. They took the Bill of Rights from UK and they revised it in America. Yeah, so the Constitution, I don't know if you came to my channel, I don't know, Gullah, but the Constitution, the form of government, that's like what I've been studying and reading. I got so many videos on that. Yeah, so I also was, I think you even sent that link before in my in the chat, and I read it because I had my own thing, but you pulled yours up. Yours like was more elaborate, is more detailed. Yeah, but you put it before, and I read the whole thing because that's something I'm into. But anyway, 5% of the total male population was able to vote. The Meiji Constitution might not seem very democratic today. At the time, however, it was widely praised. It provided for more, only 5% could vote of the male population. It was widely praised. It was bad. It provided for more popular involvement and many more checks and balances than earlier rule by the shoguns. Many Japanese were already literate at the start of the Meiji period, thanks to the, was it samurai government? That, or was it the Meiji? Go back and, who said elementary? Was it the Meiji government? Yeah. It was the new government. Yeah, it was the Meiji that said young kids need to go to elementary school. One estimate suggests 40% of boys and 15% of girls knew how to read. Widespread trade and commerce in Tokugawa times meant the Japanese already established sophisticated bank institutions, even if they were not nationwide. These and other legacies from the Tokugawa gave the Meiji economy a head start. Not everyone was happy about the changes Meiji leaders brought to Japan. Some samurai opposed the abolition of their status in the 1870s. Let's see how that worked out for them. They fought a war in southwestern Japan against imperial forces. Although they were defeated, the war was costly for the new government. Commoners resisted sending their children to the new elementary schools. So commoners had that same problem they got in this country. They wanted to homeschool as though they can compete with public schools. Some school buildings were burnt to the ground, but most Japanese seem to have eventually been persuaded that the Meiji policies were good ones, or at least that resistance would not succeed. The Japanese proved able students of industry and technology. The first train line linking Tokyo and Yokohama opened in 1872. Just 4 years after the Meiji Restoration, trains quickly became the symbol of the new modern Japan. Woodblock prints. Don't forget, I started off in 1850, right? Okay. Major cities soon gained the use of electricity. By 1880, people in most cities would communicate with each other by telegraph. So now everybody can communicate by 1880. The government also created a standard currency. There we go. The yen. 1880, the yen was created and a system of national banks to promote savings and investment, along with civilization and enlightenment is the chant. Another important slogan of the era was, it's like a curse, Fokuku, Kayuhi, Kayuhei, Fokuku, Kayuhei, enrich the country, strengthen the army, right? So that was another chant, another slogan. Enrich the country, strengthen the army. You got some groups in America that don't want to touch any weapons. While successful businessmen worked to make Japan a rich country, the government continued to invest in its military. Those investments paid off. In 1876, Japanese gunboats forced the Koreans to sign an unequal treaty of their own. So Japanese signed an unequal treaty with the Americans and was pissed off, but they ended up having the Koreans sign one of their own. Hypocrites. A military expedition that same year helped the Japanese assert control over the Ryukyu Islands. But Japan's greatest military achievements of the Meiji period were its victories over China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. You heard it. Japan. 40 years later, after 200 some odd warlords, class systems, samurai could only be in government, merchants was forever to be poor, all this stuff is going on. 40 years later, they beat China, and 50 years later, they beat Russia, a European nation. Both of these wars were fought in part to protect Japanese interests in Korea. So they ain't even protecting Japan. It's all about Korea. By the 1880s, some Japanese were trying to support Korean reformers who were interested in Meiji-style reforms for their own country. Other Japanese were simply concerned that Korea was too close to Japan to allow an unfriendly government to control it. Kind of like the issue Russia and Ukraine is going through right now. So Japan like, yo, we got to take over Korea. We can't let these European powers take it over, or even China. Can't let that happen. So we'll just take it. Conservative Koreans saw themselves as allies of the Chinese. Tensions between the Chinese and Japanese over Korea led to a war in 1894. Okay, pull up. I said it's ours. You think it's yours? Okay, pull up. China was bigger, more populous, and the traditional power in East Asia. They were the traditional power in the East Asia. They were the big dogs until Japan decided to get educated by the Westerners. Now, Japan is going to be the big dog. Most people, therefore, expect the Chinese to win. But Japanese forces were better trained. Who trained them? Westerners. Better equipped. Who equipped them or helped them be equipped? Westerners. And employed more effective tactics. Who taught them? Prussia. Westerners. They defeated the Chinese and won major concessions. Westerners. The concessions included control of Taiwan and a large monetary payment. The victory was a source of great pride. Japanese intellectuals and the general public were overjoyed at the news of their nation's success, but that joy was short-lived. What happened? Russia, France, and Germany, oh boy, here comes those Westerners, intervened to prevent the Japanese from taking all over the Chinese territory. They had one. So they like, oh, stop right there in Taiwan. Don't leave from there, big boy. These other territories, that's ours. We won those. This incident was known as the Triple Intervention. Many Japanese felt it was unjust, but they were not ready to challenge three European powers. Fall back. We taught you everything you know. We know how you can, we know what guns you got, you know what boats and Relax. They don't want this smoke. Meanwhile, Korea sought to keep its independence by balancing the great powers against each other. So they're like, all right, they fighting over us. Let's keep them fighting. With China no longer a player, some Koreans turned to Russia as a counter to Japan. The Japanese were preparing for war against Russia. So Japan, like, listen, man, European powers taught us a lot. They helped us with a lot. Man, Russia is really in our way right now. We got to handle them. But they were concerned that the French and Germans might help the Russians. All right. So they like, we got to fall back because those Westerners, man, they on some other, you dig? They gonna wipe us off the planet if we mess around and attack Russia without permission. Some mafia stuff. You need permission to hit. Such fears were erased in 1902, when the Japanese and British entered into the Anglo-Japanese alliance. What happened? Those fears were erased in 1902, when the Japanese and British entered into the Anglo-Japanese alliance. So the Japanese got down with the British, knowing that the British would help them if Germany or France tried to help the Russians. Slick. So they got down. They got down with the Westerners, like Moroccans. They got down with the Westerners. They didn't run. They didn't say, nah, screw them, barbarians. They got down. And what happened afterwards? The Japanese in 1904 launched a surprise attack on Russia's Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. They later sank Russia's Baltic Fleet as well. The Japanese also won some important land battles, but they incurred heavy losses. By 1905, the Japanese were at the limits of their manpower and supply capabilities. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt helped the two sides negotiate a peace agreement. Okay. The Japanese gained rights in Korea and Manchuria, as well as the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Okay, we're almost done. Around the world, Japan gained the respect of many. The Russo-Japanese War was the first major conflict in which the Russo-Japanese War was the first major conflict in which a non-Western country had defeated a Western imperial power. Okay, so that killed that stereotype, that rumor that Europeans wouldn't back a non-European against a European. They backed Japan. They had an alliance with Japan, and Japan went after Russia. Didn't care if France intervened. All right, so we're educating and we're debunking certain talking points. The Russo-Japanese War was the first major conflict in which a non-Western country had defeated a Western imperial power. So Western powers were undefeated with their education, technology, and things like that. Japan borrowed their education and technology and things like that, and they became one of them basically in force. Yet the Japanese were not fighting to help free Asian states from Western colonial rule. Nah, y'all your own. In fact, Japan had decided to join the Western powers and acquire colonies of its own. It already administered Taiwan as a result of the Sino-Japanese War settlement of 1895. Following the Russo-Japanese War, it made Korea into a protectorate in 1905 and then a colony in 1910. Many Koreans tried to oppose the Japanese and keep their independence, but no outside power was willing to stand up against Japan in East Asia. They became the big dogs. The United States secretly agreed to Japan's actions in exchange for Japanese respect for U.S. control of the Philippines. You see? So Europe is about business, okay? So don't count yourself out. A number of factors explain Japan's push for colonies. The Japanese, so they're not just crazy. The Japanese sought raw materials like iron and oil that were hard to come by in Japan. So now you see why people colonized. They also wanted overseas markets where they could sell goods made in Japan. Colonies also offered land. Since the Japanese thought their own islands were overpopulated, they encouraged citizens to settle in the colonies. Finally, the Japanese wanted their country to be thought of as the equal of the great powers of the West. On this last point, they were only somewhat successful. The Japanese had an impressive list of accomplishments by the early 20th century. They had reformed their country's government, social structure, educational system, and more. What they do? They reformed their country's government, social structure, educational system, and more. They were the first who were they? They were the first non-Western people to industrialize. They were the first non-Western people to industrialize. They had won 2 foreign wars and acquired territories overseas. This is what they did in less than 50 years. But these successes provided little comfort to government leaders. Leaders were increasingly uneasy about Japan's future. At home, Japanese officials feared that new ideas like anarchism and new groups like trade unions and the women's rights movement would disrupt the social order. Abroad, the colonization of Korea led Japan leaders to seek to expand further in order to protect the new borders of their empire. They set their sights on Manchuria. It offered railroads and natural resources, and it was close to Korea. But continually expanding military budgets meant higher taxation and conflicts with the parliament. The Meiji novelist Natsume Soseki wrote that he feared his country would suffer from a nervous collapse. Japan may have arrived, that is, joined the ranks of the world's leading nations, but like many other industrialized countries, it still wrestled with serious problems in the early 20th century. The Russo-Japanese War was very costly. The Japanese had borrowed heavily to pay for the war. Now they needed to repay those loans as well as maintain troops overseas. The treaty ending the war did not require the Russians to pay a large war indemnity like the Chinese had 10 years later, or 10 years earlier. The Japanese public had been expecting more. When the terms of the treaty were released, people in Tokyo rioted. They were disappointed by the terms of the treaty and frustrated by the fact that many people were still excluded from the political process. It was not until 1918 that Haraki, a party politician, was selected as prime minister. 1918, Haraki, a party politician, was selected as prime minister. Meanwhile, harsh working conditions in Japan's factories and agricultural fields led people to question the existing order. In 1900, the government, hoping to avoid labor problems, passed laws that made strikes and other union activities illegal. It also closed down the office of Japan's Socialist Party only hours after it opened in 1901. But some people chose to join trade unions anyway. Tenant farmers marched in protest over the high rents charged by landlords. As it was true in many countries, some people became radical in their opposition to the government. In 1911, a small group of anarchists were executed after being convicted of plotting to assassinate the Meiji emperor. He just got there. More than 1 million people took part in riots across the country. Their actions led the prime minister to resign. In 1912, the Meiji emperor died at the age of 60. The Meiji emperor was succeeded by his son, who became the Taisho emperor. In many ways, the process of building national identity was completed in the Taisho period. Japan had matured into a stable, prosperous nation. More and more people were living in cities and suburbs by the 1920s. Cars, buses, trolleys allowed people to commute to work. In 1927, Tokyo opened the first subway line in East Asia. White collar jobs and expanding economy helped create a true middle class. Families had money to spend at restaurants, on entertainment, and for travel. They were living their best life, in other words. Japan's universal education system, a very high rates. Japan's universal education system and very high rates of literacy. Very high rates of what? Literacy, education, literacy, education led to a boom in the publishing of books, journals, and newspapers. Social and cultural changes generally do not occur as quickly as political changes, and this was true for Japan. Many men wore Western suits to work, but they changed into Japanese clothing when they returned home. Some women also started wearing Western dresses, though most favored kimono even outside of the home. Although restaurants offer a wide range of foreign fare, most home meals feature rice, fish, and other foods the Japanese have been eating since the Tokugawa times. The prosperity and confidence of Japan capital city was shaken when a major earthquake struck Tokyo in 1923. Many of the city buildings were built of wood and paper. They collapsed or caught on fire. More than 130,000 people died. In the aftermath, false rumors, look what happened, those conspiracy theorists. In the aftermath, false rumors spread blaming Korean residents for poisoning wells. As a result, vigilante Japanese attacked and killed thousands of innocent Koreans. That's messed up. Conspiracy theorists everywhere. The police also took advantage. Who took advantage? The police. The police, not the police. Yeah, because they're humans too. The police also took advantage of the confusion to arrest left-wing political activists, some of whom they killed. This was a dark chapter in the generally bright history of modern Tokyo. Party politicians gained power by working closely with bureaucrats and by sponsoring local and regional development projects. But their most powerful tool was the ability to veto the budget. According to the Constitution, the lower house of the parliament had to approve the budget. If they did not approve it, then the previous year's budget would be used. In these decades, as Japan's economy was growing, the military was expanding and overseas commitments were increasing. The previous year's budget was never enough. Party politicians negotiated with bureaucrats, offering to support budget proposals in exchange for things on their own agendas. Between 1918 and 1932, most of the prime ministers were party politicians. Some scholars label this period of Taisho democracy. But not all party politicians had popular support, and Parliament did not extend voting rights to all male citizens until 1925. The same Parliament also passed a peace preservation law that year. This law strictly regulated the things people could debate or advocate. No freedom of speech, huh? For example, political groups that wanted to overthrow the government or abolish private property were declared illegal. Women became more active in public life, though they were still barred from voting or standing for election. Women were discouraged from taking part in politics. Instead, they were taught to be good wives and wise mothers. They were to support their husbands, raise the children, supervise their education, and manage household affairs. The Meiji government actively promoted this ideal for women. The government publicly praised and gave awards to women who exemplified the spirit of sacrifice for family. Of course, only women of the upper and upper middle classes could afford to be full-time wives and mothers. Many other women needed to work. Urban jobs included work as secretaries, teachers, cell girls, and bus attendants. In the countryside, women often worked on farms or in textile mills. Other women rejected the good wife, wise mother ideal. Equally controversial, however, were the so-called moga, or modern girls. Modern girls, so we got modern women today. These young women like many around the world in the 1920s, adopted short hairstyles, short hemlines, and freer attitudes toward dating and sexuality. Freer, freer. You already know what I'm doing. Okay. I do what I want to do. Liberated women. They favored Western fashions and were seen as trendsetters. Some worked as cafe waitresses, attracting male customers. Japan's modern Japan's modern girl clearly paralleled trends in the United States and Europe. Her emergence can be seen as evidence that Japan had become part of international society. Japan joined the Allies during World War One. So Japan joined the Allies during World War One. It became a founding member of the League of Nations. But the Japanese could not get the Americans and Europeans to agree to a racial equality clause at the Versailles peace negotiations. So European powers refused to look at the Japanese as an equal. Not surprising. In 1924, the US Congress passed an act barring Japanese nationals from moving to the States. So US Congress passed an act barring Japanese nationals from moving to the States. We don't rock with y'all like that. America was showing their true colors. Many Japanese saw these moves as insulting and proof that the rest of the world still looked down on them. Japan connections to world financial markets were also questioned when a banking crisis in 1927 and the Great Depression of 1929 hurt Japan's economy. Criticism became even louder in 1930 when Japanese diplomats signed another disarmament treaty that limited the size of the Japanese Navy. Right-wing extremists in Japan attacked businessmen and politicians. They even shot the prime minister in November of that year.